Okay, guys, so today is the third lecture in continuation of the previous two on error analysis. And today we are going to discuss the last two steps in the process and methodology of error analysis. So if we just try to recall the steps that were given by Corbett in 1974, he has suggested some stages for error analysis, because error analysis is a methodology, error analysis is a process, therefore it takes place in certain steps. Some of the steps we have already covered in the previous two lectures, like the first step of collection of sample of learner's language. And then we talked about identification of errors. And once we have identified the errors and we have differentiated between error and mistakes, then it's time to describe the errors. And once we have described the errors, then we need to explain these errors also. So how is explanation different from description? Now, in explanation of errors, we have to, or we need to establish the source of errors, why an error is made. So there can be different sources of errors. The sources may have to do with psycholinguistics, sociolinguistics, epistemic, and it can be, discourse structure. Much of the focus in the research on error analysis is on psycholinguistics, if the source lies within the field of psycholinguistics. So we would be doing a detailed discussion on this particular source. But before we move on to discuss this in detail, let's talk about the error sources that have been pointed out by Taylor in 1986. So if we say that the source of an error lies somewhere in psycholinguistics, we mean that second language knowledge system is deficient, or there are difficulties in producing the target language system. Okay, what might be those difficulties? We're going to do that in detail. Whereas sociolinguistic sources are difficult to determine because that refers to failure in adjusting language according to the social context. That means appropriateness. When the learner knows the structures and he is correct in using the target language, but fails to adjust language in the social context. Okay, that is, he's unable to use the language appropriately despite using the language correctly. Then the source can be epistemic. That means that there is lack of world knowledge on the part of the learner. Then another source might be discourse structures. When the learner has problems in organization of discourse text, that means maybe he's unable to take care of cohesion and coherence. Okay, he's unable to maybe sometimes grammatically connect the items of the language, or there is no coherence, or the language, his performance lacks coherence in a way that he is unable to logically connect the ideas. So if that's the case, then we can say that source lies in deficiency in discourse structures. Now, as I told you that we would be talking about more and in detail about the psycholinguistic sources. So here you can see it's a very good and very brief, concise kind of flowchart where you can see that, of course, the errors are divided into errors of competence and errors of performance. And as we differentiate between errors and mistakes, so we would be focusing on when there is a deviance from the norm, and this is coming from lack of competence. So we would be working with lack of competence that are called as errors. So psycholinguistically, these errors of competence can be due to transfer, okay, when person or the learner is trying to take help from L1 also, right? And this cannot be avoided whenever a language system is already present in the mind of the learner in the form of L1 or the mother tongue. Then learning another system, of course, does not replace it at all and cannot do that, and it should not be done. So a number of times there is interference or the learner falling back for help on the first system that is already in place in his mind. So all of these psycholinguistic um, sources of errors come from interaction between two systems that the learner is trying to work with, one that he has already acquired, the second that he's trying to learn. So errors of competence can be because of transfer in the two systems, intralingual errors, for instance overgeneralization, learning one rule in a language and applying it at other places, transitional competence, okay, while a learner is trying to become competent while he's already competent in one system. Then there can be unique errors which are neither intralingual or developmental, okay, so these are unique to a person, to a particular learner, and these can be induced also. And now induced errors are due to the way the person is taught the second language. Okay, whatever happens inside the classrooms, maybe the learner has misinterpreted the given information, or he is misusing it, or he's unable to use it, or maybe um, the teacher failed to teach a particular structure or a particular part of the language. Okay, that would lead to unique error, error specific to an individual, and that is in particular such errors are called as induced errors. Okay, and then the performance errors are uh, maybe because of the processing processes and communication strategies. That means the person has that in his competence, but he's unable to perform the competence, as we say. Right? Now, moving on to some other sources of errors, maybe the kind of errors also. These sources leads to the types of errors. Like interference is a source, and that leads to interference errors. Okay. Now, one thing more is we can try to take help, for example, for examples from our own language sometimes. But since we are dealing with English as a second language, and through contrastive analysis, we know that it is closer to the other European languages. So most of the examples that you'll find in error analysis in this chapter or in any other chapter or any other material or analysis would be in comparison of English with other European languages. So trying to find out examples from languages which have absolutely a different family, that would be difficult. Okay, sometimes we can give examples of misusing of prepositions, or unable to use prepositions of English correctly because they are directly translated from Urdu language, right? So we have very few examples as far as intralingual errors or interference errors are concerned from our own language. And most of the examples that you will see here are from Italian language or German language, which are the European language. And I told you that they are similar to English language and can be compared to. So these are some of the sources again which are given by Richards in 1971, and these are interference errors. Okay, the use of elements from one language to another language, and then again there's an example given of the German language, which of course I cannot read. But there are some of the examples that you can understand that are, when the vocabulary words of the two languages, English and another European language, for instance, Italian, are similar, then we can, understand those examples. So other than interference, there are intralingual errors, and that also is related to faulty generalization and incomplete application of rules. A learner learns one rule and overgeneralize it. Okay. And then there are developmental errors where the learner attempts to build up some hypothesis and he tries to apply the rule on his own. Okay. He hasn't seen the rule, he hasn't experienced the rule, he hasn't applied the rule, but he thinks that this might be the rule. So that is hypothetical application of the rule, and that is because of the developmental error that might have been developed during the process of learning. Okay, there are few other sources that are basically related or subcategories of the transfer errors, right? And these are given by 1983. Overextension of analogy, when the learner misuses an item because it shares features with an item in L1. And here the example is comprehensible. For example, Italian learners use process to mean trial because Italian processo has this meaning. Okay. So using one word in place of another word because the learner thinks that it might have similar meaning as it has in his mother tongue. Then transfer of structures, that is overgeneralizing or applying the structures of L1 to the structures of L2. Interlingual or intralingual errors arise when a particular distinction does not exist in L1, when there is too much similarity between maybe the vocabulary of L1 or maybe the structures of L1. Okay, for example, the use of make instead of do by Italian learners because the make-to distinction is non-existent in Italian. Okay, so this example is easy to understand also because something is correct in L1 is applied to the system of L2 and that becomes an error. Now, intralingual errors are further divided, and this is given by Richards, 1971. Overgeneralization, ignorance of rule restrictions, then incomplete application of rules, and then false concepts hypothesized. We have just done this, okay, while we were doing the psycholinguistics errors, and we have talked about it while we were dealing it with interference errors and developmental intralingual. Anyway, these are some of the categories of intralingual errors given by Richards. Okay, other than that, Burt and Dewey and Burt in 1974, they have their own classification, developmental errors, okay, that are similar to L1 acquisition interference, those errors that reflect the structures of L1, and unique errors which are neither developmental or interference, right? So these are some of the categories of errors which are given by different linguists, and more or less, they refer to the source, and they are very similar when we read the details of these. Okay, let's talk about how certain researches are done on this. You can read in this chapter that, the researchers or applied linguists or error analysts, they try to quantify these errors, okay, based on the kinds, the categories, and sources, okay. So in the following pages, you can find out how many were, transfer errors, or how many were the errors of overgeneralization. And different researchers, of course, they have come with different statistics or quantification numbers because of course, difference in context and learners, the way they collected the data, the first language of the participants of the research that became part of the sample, all of that. So all of these researches are cited to show the quantification of errors and the statistics of errors, right? Now, after this explanation of errors, we would come to the evaluation of errors, which happens to be the last step or the stage in the process of error analysis research. And as we call it, error analysis itself is methodology. So what do we do in evaluation is that first of all, we need to see that all of the other stages are related to the learners. How do the learners perform? Okay, we get the data from the sample, and sample consists of the learners. Then we identify the errors, and the errors are committed by the learners. And then the description and explanation, all of the previous stages, those are related to the examination of errors from the point of view of learners. Now, this evaluation of errors as the last stage is related to the judges or the examiners, the evaluators, or the person who is being addressed when the language is being spoken, or the language is being used, or the language is being written. Okay, so of course, when the students write something, someone is going to evaluate it, and they have the addressee in their mind. Okay, as far as research and error analysis is concerned, the judges, by judges I mean the examiners or the error analysts, right, who might have collected data or who are evaluating this data. Okay, the data is collected by someone else and the data is sent for evaluation to experts, right? So evaluation is the last stage, and it has more to do with the addressee, with the judges, with the examiners, with the teachers, with the error analysts, and less to do, the part of the learner is over here. Now what happens is, this can be gauged either in terms of addressee's comprehension of the speaker or addressee's effective response to the errors. And different um, judges or evaluators of errors would gauge the errors in terms of comprehension. Okay, if the language is comprehensible, if they are able to understand this, they might not take this error. And if they are able to respond to it and respond to the language correctly, then that's also a different thing. So there are a number of factors that can impact error evaluation. Okay, there are at least 7 factors, and these factors can also be taken as limitations of error analysis. Okay, now what errors are asked to be judged? Okay, now maybe my concern is that my student should use correct grammar, right? My concern might not be their pronunciation. Okay, um, so when I would give their error, their scripts, their composition writing, or their speech that I have transcribed, so I would ask the examiners to just look for a particular structure. Maybe I might be working on some particular structures to improve the language of my students. So I would just see if they are still making errors or what kind of errors they are making and what might be the sources of those errors. So I would just ask the examiners to look for particular structural errors or one structure error. So it really depends what errors are asked to be judged, right? Second factor might be is the judge or the examiner or evaluator or error analyst is a native speaker of English or it's a non-native speaker of English. Thirdly, is the judge or the examiner or the evaluator is an expert, like maybe a language teacher, or he's not an expert. So is he working on semantic error, lexical, grammatical, spelling, or all of these? If a proper error analysis is taking place, so we need to see the instrument that is used to collect data and to elicit judgment. Okay, of course, if you have done some research studies or if you have done some research methodology, you must know what instruments are used for data collection. And for every proper data collection, we have to construct an instrument in the field of social sciences and humanities. And then we have to see another factor that may impact the evaluation is whether the script that is given to the examiner is contextualized, or some lone decontextualized sentences are given to them. And of course, we need to see whether a written text is being analyzed for errors or an oral text which is converted to writing, right? So of course, error analysis can be done with written script, but it is not necessary that these scripts are produced by activities of writing. It can be that the spoken text or the speech of the learners are transcribed by the data analyst, right? Now, there are 3 questions on an error analysis, and their research-based answers are given in your books also on page number 63. Now, these are the 3 questions that most of the error analysis or error evaluation studies have been addressing. One is, are some errors judged to be more problematic than others? Right. That means, are there some errors that are really serious? Or are there some errors that are more serious than other errors? And how do you define the seriousness of errors in terms of comprehension, or in terms of understanding, in terms of effective response, right? Second question is, are there differences in the evaluation made by native speaker and non-native speakers, right? There have been researches which try to find out, is the focus different of a native speaker who is looking at the errors and of a non-native speakers who is looking at the same errors? Do they respond to it differently? Are there some errors that are taken more seriously by native speakers, and are there certain errors that are taken less seriously by non-native speakers or native speakers? And the third question that most of the researchers on evaluation, error evaluation, have been trying to answer, and it's a significant one also: what criteria do judges use in evaluating learners' errors, right? So there are basically 3 criteria that error examiners or error evaluators may take into consideration. One is, seriousness of the errors, intelligibility, how intelligible they are they hindering the comprehension of the listeners or the readers? And then acceptability, are there some errors that might be acceptable, that might be, you can let go of them? Or what are those errors that are not acceptable? So this is how, evaluation takes place, and there are these factors that may impact on the evaluation. So I think that's all. And as far as, the limitations of error analysis is concerned, these are related to the factors of evaluation. Okay, these happens to be the weaknesses in methodological processes, and there is limitation in the scope, right? So here, it's a short kind of paragraph related to the limitation of study, and we can do these limitations as as 3 problems to it. Now, a frequently mentioned limitation is that error analysis failed to provide a complete picture of learners' language. Of course, when errors are being worked on, they are worked on a limited kind of a sample, right? And competence errors cannot be fully evaluated, right? We need to know what learners do correctly as well as what they do wrongly. So this problem has been overstated, however. Corder explicitly recognized the importance of examining the totality of the learner's production, and there is nothing to prevent the research doing this, right? So error analysis, in a way, is an incomplete process as a matter of its limitation. Okay, because it cannot evaluate the whole language, which is of course impossible of the learners. Now, error analysis is limited in a second way. Most of the studies are cross-sectional in nature, affording only a very static view of L2 acquisition that we have already done while we were differentiating between, cross-sectional studies and longitudinal studies. So if a study on error analysis is cross-sectional, then that means it is giving a static view because it is one-time data collection. And longitudinal studies are less, which are more valid and reliable in the sense that the data is collected over a period of time, maybe 3 to 4 years, as in the last lecture we cited an example as well. Okay, so if the study is longitudinal, then that limits the scope of error analysis. Now, the third problem is more substantive, and this is related to the analysis of the relative clauses errors produced by two sets of learners, one Arabic and Iranian and the other Chinese and Japanese. Now, the third problem lies with the different learners, and that has to do with the contrastive analysis also. Okay, how similar is the first language and the second language, and then the results of two people who are working with different set of learners would be quite different, right? And another other limitation is that sometimes this contrastive analysis does not work. When the language is similar, the learners commit more errors sometimes, the research shows, and when the language is dissimilar, they might show better results. So there are issues of reliability, repeatability. So and sometimes it happens that some of the structures which are not present in the first language and they are present in the second language, but learners who do not have those structures are good at using those structures, and learners who have the similar structures in the first language and the second language make errors while using the same structures in the second language. So these are some of the limitations. If we can just summarize these limitations, we can say that error analysis, first of all, does not provide a complete picture. And then the results from cross-sectional studies, which are very, very common in the field of error analysis, where the data is collected just once and then the errors are worked on, then the studies are not longitudinal. That is also a limiting factor. And the third important factor is the failure of contrastive analysis sometimes. That also limits the studies of error analysis. So I think we have completed error analysis with the completion of this chapter in 3 lectures. Next, we are going to do syllabus designing, and we'll be doing it from Noonan. So I'll see you for the next lecture then. Take care.